It's okay, so everybody can see this?
Yes.
Okay, good. Okay, so I'm going to be talking about how we're handling blending in LSST, um, or at least the direction that it looks like we're going. So when I first came, I guess about 2 years ago and started working on this, um, I had no idea just how much interest everyone was going to have in this particular project. Um, And the reason becomes pretty obvious when you look at an image and you see that, this is an HSC image. And you can see that you just have huge blends. Most objects are blended. And so to try and do any, reasonable science with this, we have to have some handle on, how to deep blend these objects, right? So kind of quantitatively, some people have looked at, how bad blending is. So in the dark energy survey, they're looking, they're seeing about 30% of sources are blended. And it's been my understanding that for the most part, they've just been able to ignore blended sources. And so if they see blending, they just don't include those in their analysis. But it becomes much more difficult once you start looking at like HSC, which is, you're only going 2 magnitudes deeper, but now all of a sudden 58% of sources are blended. And then if you look at the LSST, if at the end of the 10-year survey going to about 27th magnitude, you're looking at about 63% of the sources are going to be blended. And so just ignoring the blended sources isn't really a good solution anymore. Oh, I should also say that I saved a lot of time just to try and make sure there's plenty of time for questions, so feel free to ask as I go if anything comes up. Okay, so in addition to objects where we see the blends, in Dawson 2016, they actually looked at what about objects that are not even recognized as multiple objects from a ground-based telescope, but then if you have space-based observations, you see that there's actually multiple objects there. So that's what we see on this screen. There's each side. There's a left-hand column that shows the ground-based Subaru observations. The right-hand side shows the HST observations in the same region. And so you see that, and so they predict that about 14% of the galaxies that are observed are actually blends, and we don't even see them. Okay, so how's the current DeBlender run in the pipeline? So DeBlending, so just part of the an overview of the DM pipeline. So you have all of the raw images, the calibration images, the reference catalogs that come in, and then that's where and so in this image characterization and calibration step, that's where source detection are done, taking a rough calibration of the single band, single frame measurements. And then that goes into coaddition and difference imaging. And then we go into once the coad's been made, processing the coads. And so right now that step, if we zoom in on the coad processing, we see that this is where DeBlending currently sits. Right? So we have so essentially there's objects are detected in each band, and then there's a catalog that's made of all the different bands, and those footprints are merged together to create kind of, the source catalogs are merged together so that you have a single catalog that's passed to each band. And right now what's done is the DeBlending's done in each band at a time. Right, so our band DeBlends, without knowing anything about any of the other filters, and G and all the other bands.
I have a question from Eric Goizer from a couple of slides ago, actually. When you talk about percentages of sourcing being blended, what definition of blending are you using?
Okay, so it's different depending on which paper you're looking at. So I can't recall what DES's criteria was. I think the HSC paper, they just looked at footprints. So there's a certain kind of threshold that they set for how large a footprint's allowed to grow. And so 58% of these footprints, the galaxies were contained in footprints that had more than one galaxy. In the LSST work by Sanchez, they're looking at objects where at least 2% of the galaxy's flux overlaps with neighboring objects. So that there's, at least on the 2% level, you're going to start having problems with neighbors.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay, right. So currently, each band is DeBlended at one time. Now, in the future, it's been proposed that there's some idea of DeBlending that's going to be done in the multi-epoch object characterization. More specifically, once you start doing force photometry, because you ideally, if you're looking at objects, want to be able to use, kind of roughly the same footprints in each epoch. But exactly how that's going to be done hasn't completely been outlined yet. And I have some ideas on ways we might do that I'll talk about a little bit later in this talk. So where might the DeBlender be run in the future? So in addition to the coed processing and the multi-epoch object characterization, we may also throw DeBlending into the image calibration and the image differencing. And so we'll see a little bit later, if we want to do anything in crowded fields, then there may be some iterative process in here that includes blending. Okay, so what does the current DeBlender do, right? And so this was originally the Sloan DeBlender that was mostly done by Robert Lupton, and then it was put into HSC with a few modifications, but basically the same procedure. So what it does is it goes through all of the objects that are detected in a single blend, right? And so to determine a blend, basically you look at, like kind of a noise threshold for the flux. And if you have objects if you have multiple peaks, multiple objects that all are contained in the same footprint, then you consider that a blend. And so what it first does is it looks at all the objects and just attempts to fit them to the PSF. And if it does, then it just calls those stars. It figures out what the amplitude needs to be in order for that to match the PSF as best as possible. For everything else that didn't fit the PSF, and there's some percentage of, it has to fit the PSF to a certain percentage, and that's what's used to determine whether or not it's a star or not. So for everything else, then it looks at the peak flux again, this is all done in a single band. And then for each pixel, it looks at its symmetric partner. And it takes the minimum of both of those pixels. And so you can see how this would be useful in a blend, because if you have an object on one side and nothing on the other side, then the side of the object that's not constrained, that's not blended with anything else, is going to help constrain the shape on its opposite side. Right? Now, obviously, objects aren't perfectly symmetric, but it turns out that symmetry is a really powerful argument that was really clever when it was first put in, and it turns out to be really useful. After that, there's obedience smoothing, because as you can imagine, just kind of like this pixelated template that you get can be improved if you add a smoothing filter to it. And then the templates are made to be monotonic. Especially, this helps when you have this case where you might have three objects that are kind of all in a row, right? So if you have an object to the left of the source you're looking at and an object to the right of it, then symmetry doesn't really help because you have pixels, kind of above what they should be on both sides. And so if you say you want the solution to be monotonic, then that means that you always want it to fall off. And that turns out to be a useful way of deblending. And then once that's done, and once you have these templates that are made that are both symmetric and monotonic, then the current DeBlender goes back to the data that came in and uses those templates to reweight the flux. So at that point you have, so we would say it conserves flux. So if you have the original data, the flux that you get out, all of that's going to be accounted for in one of the objects, just kind of weighted by their templates and the overlapping regions. And so if you only have one object that has a template in one region, then all the flux goes to that. And then there's some other procedures of what to do if you have some flux that doesn't fit into any of the objects.
Right, I have a question from Town Laredo.
Sure.
Can we read about the SDSS Blender anywhere? Is there a document?
I believe that Robert has a document that's unpublished, but there isn't anything that's published on it. But there's a document that's available.
Is it in the photo light pipeline document? He has some document online that I haven't read yet, but have stumbled upon.
Yeah, I think it's that one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well,
there's also a brief discussion in the HSC pipeline paper.
In which one? In the HSC paper? Okay. Jim's paper.
Okay. Links to these things, if you guys could provide them, that would be helpful. I will try to hunt that down myself.
Okay. All right, so now we'll talk about kind of the DeBlender that we're developing right now. And so this is a collaborative effort mostly between myself and Peter Melchior, who's also a postdoc at Princeton and who's working on the WFirst project. And essentially, he's looking at being able to do the blending of LSST and WFirst data together. And so when we first started kind of working together, we realized that one of the problems with the blending is that it's all done in a single band. And we're getting rid of a lot of information. So if we just add color, it really helps a lot to distinguish different objects. I mean, you can see, like certain, kind of blue objects and red objects around other sources that just really stick out once you add color. And so the basic model that we use is we say that every object is going to be made up of components. It may be just like one component for a star. For a galaxy, you may have a bulge and a disk. But however you end up breaking stars and galaxies up, we say that they're a collection of components. Each component has a single morphology and the same SED for that morphology. So in each band, essentially, we're saying that it has the same morphology. And so you can see an example of that here, where on the right, you see the SEDs for all of the objects in this image. And then along the bottom, this is the morphology that we combine with the SEDs to try and recreate the data. So I'll briefly show a little bit more mathematical description of the way this works. Essentially, you can picture it as having a matrix of SEDs multiplied by a matrix of morphologies where the pixel dimension's been flattened out. And then we just want to minimize, the likelihood of the data minus this model with some constraints, right? Because there's, infinite numbers of solutions to this problem. And so we put in constraints to try and end up in a space that is realistic without throwing in too many priors. And so we use an accelerated gradient descent with something called proximal operators to solve this. And we can always talk later or offline if people have questions about how the exact solution, how that's done. Okay. Oops. There we go. Okay, so how do we initialize it? Well, we actually take a very similar approach to the Sloan DeBlender in that we initialize with the symmetric and monotonic template at each peak. So we look at each point source, and we say that a symmetric monotonic template is a good place to initially approximate it. And then once we use that template, we then take that template for the source, apply it to the image, and that gives us our initial guess at the SED. And so for example, this peak 3 in this image here, you can see it along the bottom. So the image on the left is its initial is the initial guess, and then on the right is what it came to after 27 iterations. Okay. As far as SED constraints, we want it to be not. Oh,
Can I ask you a question?
sure.
By monotonic, you mean monochromatic?
Oh no, so it's falling. It's always falling. The flux is always decreasing from the peak. So as you move radially from the center,
Okay. And
it's
so is this done separately in each band then? I'm just trying to figure out how you calculate this SED from these templates.
okay. So initially, what we do is we make we just we make a weighted coed, you could say, for the source, right? So you just take each band and you make a rough footprint, and because this is just an initial guess, and we just say, okay, we want this to be, what's the monotonic solution for this,
Mm-hmm.
and then once the algorithm starts running, it's always going to be monotonic because there's only one morphology. So everything that's happening in the spatial dimension in terms of flux is only happening on the morphology, right? And so we constrain the SED and the morphology separately.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. And so for the SED, we say we want it to be non-negative, and we want it to sum to unity, right? So this is basically the constraint to break the degeneracy in SED morphology space. And then for the morphology, we say that we want it to be non-negative. We can optionally use an L0 sparsity, which is essentially means we want them to be compact. And then for symmetry, we allow for a soft symmetry, which means it doesn't have to necessarily be perfectly symmetric, but we allow for the case where maybe you say, well, we don't want it to be more than kind of 80% symmetric. Different from symmetry by more than 80% or something like that. Although in our testing, we actually found that using strict symmetry and just saying we want it to be perfectly symmetric seems to work best in regions that have a lot of overlap, just because there's so much kind of information that you can get by looking at the flux on the opposite side, and that's it. Objects are more symmetric than you would initially think just by looking at them.
I have a question from Apajita that Robert actually answered already in the chat. Apajita was asking how is the peak defined and what is the initial threshold? And Robert replied that there is a 5 sigma PSF detection, and also added that the SDSS DeBlender is on his homepage and should be resubmitted 10 years later. We may get it.
I ought to resubmit it, but I got tired many years ago. It should go to AstroPH, mea culpa.
So Apajita has a follow-up question, which is, so faint 3 sigma neighbors will be missed and not fit if there is a 5 sigma PSF detection threshold for the peak?
Right. So I'll actually talk about a little bit what we do when we see that there have been faint neighbors that have been missed. So if you can wait a few minutes, we'll get to that.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm. So for morphology, as I said, the other constraint we use is monotonicity. And if we were to actually make kind of the analytic monotonic solution, and iterate that in each step, it turns out to be really expensive in terms of CPU time. And so we have an algorithm that approximates monotonicity. Essentially what we do for each pixel is we look at the 3 reference pixels, we look at all the pixels that are closer to the peak than the current pixel. And for each of those pixels, then we just weight them based on the angle to the peak. And so we say we want, the current pixel to have less flux than the weighted sum of those 3. And so it's a way to prevent kind of these spiky fractal-like things that you can see when you have a monotonic, when you have just kind of a naive monotonic solution.
I have a question from Tom Loredo. Tom is asking if there is a motivation for the L0, since L1 is probably more common sparsity-inducing norm. Is there a computational motivation?
We found that it seems to work best as far as keeping objects compact and having a consistent threshold to set. So the thing when you're using an L1 is then so the L0, you're just looking at the number of pixels that you use, right? When you use an L1, you get, trying to remember which one it is. I think you get a bias toward getting more flux from brighter objects. If you're using an L0, you're biased to getting more flux from fainter objects. And I think we found that seemed to be a better solution. But that's still open to testing, right? And how we apply sparsity, this can certainly change. Okay.
Tom seems to be happy.
Okay.
He has an iterator. Go ahead.
Okay. So obviously in different bands, they're going to have a different PSF. And so if we're fitting the solution simultaneously, we have to take that into account. And so, so that essentially makes our model a little bit more complicated because now we have to do a PSF convolution. And the other thing that we do is a translation because this model is a bit more sensitive than the Sloan DeBlender to position because because we're treating the solution as being monotonic and symmetric about the peak, and we're treating this more as a model than just a template to weight the to weight the data on. And so because of that, we want to make sure that we have a better estimate of the peak than just the integer positions of pixels. And so we have to perform a fractional translation. And we do this as linear approximations. So essentially we build a matrix, which is the PSF convolution matrix, and we build a matrix with the translation matrix. And we apply that to the morphologies, and then we multiply that by the SED component in that band. And so so you can see the results here, taking the data. You see the model in the middle is without using any PSF deconvolution, and the model on the right is doing a full PSF deconvolution. But there's problems with doing the full deconvolution, right? One of them is that the constraints are all acting on the deconvolved space. And so that's assuming that it's well sampled. And so if you're doing the full deconvolution, obviously that's not true. And so you start to get artifacts. So kind of some of the regular blending artifacts that you get are made worse, or at least not helped when you're doing a full deconvolution. And so what we do is we do a partial deconvolution. And so you can see the result here, how, so this is looking at peak 3 that's up there in the corner. And if you look at that, you notice that, kind of when we don't match the PSF, you see some interference from the neighbors, right? You see some extra flux both in the top right and the bottom left. And then the full deconvolution doesn't really suppress that at all. Whereas it does a much better job if we're essentially choosing like a Gaussian PSF, and then in each band, finding the difference kernel to that. And so the way we do that, we use a Moffett, not a Gaussian. So we target a Moffett PSF, and then we create the difference kernel in each band, and we use an L0 sparsity here just to use the sparsest representation in each band. And because the more pixels you're using, the longer and more computationally expensive it is to do the deconvolution. Sure, go ahead.
There's a couple of questions online. So, Tom, do you want to ask yourself?
Sure. So I don't want to derail things, so just dismiss this and move on if it's too dumb. But I'm kind of confused about exactly what is meant by PSF. So depending on where you read in the literature, there's a PSF that basically describes the optics and takes you from position on the celestial sphere to a radiation field in the detector on the focal plane. And then there are things that have various names, intrapixel sensitivity maps, pixel response functions that then tell you how that gets mapped to the response of individual pixels, kind of like integrating over a pixel, except obviously it's more complicated. And so in some of the SDSS literature, PSF seems to be used for the thing that's like the optical transfer function. In other places, it seems to be a combination of both. Here, you're talking about these fractional translations, and so I'm just trying to understand exactly what the PSF is, why it doesn't already include the ability to be somewhere within a pixel. I don't want to derail things too much about the details, but is there like a document somewhere that writes down in math like exactly what the PSF is and talks about intrapixel sensitivity and that kind of stuff?
I should mention that that a lot of this work has been published. It's in a paper. It's in press right now.
Peters?
So that's in Peters. Yeah, so that's in Peters' paper.
So is that on Archive or?
So you can find it. You can find it on Archive.
Okay.
And so that gives kind of the more algorithmic description of what we're doing.
Uh-huh.
If you go to the documentation, which I think I linked to in the end of the slide, or at the end of this presentation, you'll see that there's that we give some examples, kind of as far as like, Python objects and everything, what all these things are and how they work together and how to actually use them.
Okay, great.
But to answer part of your question, so in terms of translations, what we're doing, and I think maybe I get to it in a couple slides, but we have a box that's drawn around each image, right? Because we're kind of forward thinking about what we want to do in crowded fields, and instead of having to use the entire blend for each object, we make as small of a box around the objects as we need to, and the object centered in the box, right? So we can make this object that's perfectly centered in this odd numbered pixel grid, symmetric and monotonic. And then we project that each object onto a common model. And so it's the translations that are done there to translate that perfectly centered box into the fractional pixels needed, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think so. I'll look at the paper.
Okay.
What's going on? Thanks.
Mm-hmm.
As a bit of clarification, that we do always include the pixel response in the PSF, and the reason that we can't do full exact PSF model-based shifting here is really an optimization question. We could do that, but it would require a reversal of the order of operations, and it'd be much, much slower than the way things are implemented right now.
Got it.
So is the paper that you're referring to a study of the PSF in SDSS images?
No. It's how we handle. It's basically how this DeBlender works, and so there's a mention in there of how we treat the PSF and what linear approximation that we're using to convolve the morphology in each band.
Okay.
I'll answer Tom's question directly in the chat. Say exactly mathematically how to think about the problem.
Oh, okay, great.
Great, thank you.
Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about some science cases then, and how we're either already handling them or how we see ourselves handling them in the future. So Aaron Sheldon has an undergraduate student who's been taking a look at at shear measurements using the new DeBlender, and trying to see what biases we get out of that. And so one of the things that we found is there's still a bias that's due to the PSF deconvolution. And we think that that's due to the fact that we're using this linear approximation. And so when we try to fit that, you notice that the bias is 2 orders of magnitude higher if we're doing PSF deconvolution, and still an order of magnitude higher if we're doing PSF matching versus not doing PSF matching. And so ideally one would say, well, let's just not match the PSFs, but the problem is that it's going to be different in each band for, sometimes, radically different for different seeing. And so that's not really an option. So we have to make sure that we're doing this properly. And so this is something that Peter's looking into right now, is trying to find an analytic well, essentially he has the algorithm. It's coding it in now to do analytic PSF convolutions and translations, possibly in a wavelet basis. And so the advantage of the solution that he's implementing now is that this will work for multi-survey deblending. So essentially what we expect to have is a really high sampled morphology that's, will fit the space-based image. And then we'll be doing the convolution so that you can convolve it into the space-based image into the ground-based bands, and so that we can deblend the whole thing together. And so the other thing that we're looking at is applying constraints to the convolved models. And so one of the things that we notice is if we initially guess a source to be too wide, and so then when it tries to narrow down the size of the source as it's iterating in the DeBlender, we found that you tend to get some kind of problems that come along with the PSF when you're doing the deconvolution. But if we just apply the constraints to the convolved models, we think that that's going to go away. Okay, so we're also looking to do things with crowded field photometry. The first thing that I'll make sure that I mention is that this is, as far as the LSST survey goes, this isn't part of what DM is supposed to deliver. In crowded fields, it's supposed to give good difference imaging, but not necessarily handle crowded field photometry. And so it's kind of this is something that we're going to try, and if this works, then that's great. But if it doesn't, there's an open question as to what we'll do in regions with crowded fields. But I'm hoping that's not going to be necessary, because we've tried to set this up in such a way that we think this is going to be optimized for that. So as I mentioned a couple minutes ago, what we do is we just have each object contained in the smallest box. And so we essentially have a detection threshold. And we say that as long as the flux is above this threshold, we allow the box to grow until it gets so big that you've hit what it calls the background. And so theoretically, we should be able to model the full CCD or patch as a single blend. And it should only scale roughly linear with the number of objects. Because for each object, we're only looking at the small patch around it. And so it'll be more sensitive to the crowding and how many objects are overlapping than the number of objects in the blend. But this still needs to be tested and optimized. So we haven't tried running this on anything that large yet. And, there's certainly the possibility that there could be some memory leak or something somewhere that we haven't noticed yet. The other thing that's needed in crowded fields, and this is whether you're talking about crowded stellar fields or crowded, extragalactic fields like a galaxy cluster, is iterative detection, and maybe even using multiband detection, so that instead of just looking at a single band and looking at the threshold being over a certain amount, you may be able to look at the bands and see where there's a correlation in the color, and so you can detect fainter objects. So you're seeing an example here from our paper where the left is an image from the HSC Cosmos field. The middle is the model if it's just fitting each object as a single component, and then on the right is the residual. And so you notice for the galaxies, for most of the galaxies, you see that we should probably be modeling them as two components, a bulge and a disk, because most of them have kind of this bulge component that's a different color in the center. And so that's part of why we're missing those. But you can also notice that in sources 25 and 19, you actually see that there's, two sources, two stellar sources probably that were behind those that we missed. And so actually adding this into the code so that we can start doing iterative multiband detection, and then do detection to blending, and keep trying to get fainter and fainter objects is something that we hope to try. Okay, so future work in crowded field photometry. So we want to be able to do multi-epoch deblending, right? Especially if you're looking in the galactic plane, high proper motion sources are going to be in different locations. right? So we need to slightly change the way that we're handling things. We know how to do it. It hasn't been implemented yet, where we can potentially use the positions given to us by difference imaging, and then each epoch of observations that we would take we would still use the same morphology for each source, but now we would shift it to its position in each epoch. And so essentially we're just adding a time dimension, and also potentially an amplitude dimension, so for variable sources. So you may have a source, again, it should have roughly the same morphology, it should have the same color, but maybe you allow both its amplitude and position to vary. And then we also may use improved priors. For example, if we know that we're in a region like the galactic plane where most things are going to be stars, then maybe we initialize the objects differently, where instead of trying to fit this kind of initial morphology footprint, this monotonic and symmetric footprint, maybe we just make them a single point source involved with the PSF and only allow them to grow if they need to. Maybe we have a template of stellar SEDs, and we try to make their colors match with kind of the known stellar SEDs, something like that.
Sorry, the constraint on the same SED and the same color, is it because you're mostly thinking of, but no, because you said amplitude, so I don't understand why you're constraining the same SED. If it's a variable source, the SED will change, the color will change, likely.
In that case, then we would also have to, then it would, I guess you'd have the same morphology, and you could allow the colors to change as well, if it's variable in some colors and more than others. But it's the same rough idea, right? Where essentially we're saying there's some components of the model that are going to be consistent across epochs, essentially the morphology, and then some that we allow to change, and possibly with some constraints on how much they're allowed to change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so what are some other unanswered questions? One of them is, what do we do with the outputs from Scarlet? Do we treat them the same way as we're treating the current DeBlender outputs and just use those to reweight the data, so essentially conserving flux? Do we try to adapt these to Sursic models where and potentially even mixed in with during the deblending? So that's something that Peter's played around with a little bit. Or do we think that we can get to a point where the models are good enough that some of the measurements can be done directly on the models? For example, we think that we see that the SEDs that we get are better if we just do them on the Scarlet models than if we do them trying to use those to reweight the flux in the data. But again, these are still open questions that we have to test and try. How do we identify and handle spirals, right? So you can imagine a spiral galaxy made up of a collection of components where, essentially different parts of the spiral arms are, at least monotonically decreasing. The arms themselves probably aren't symmetric, but some of that may be captured in, kind of a symmetric around the central object. But what's going to be the best way to handle, things with multiple components like that? Do we use some sort of machine learning or something to try and classify, this looks like it's a spiral and these components should all be put back together? So we still have to look into that. What do we do about irregulars, right, that are, not symmetric in any way, shape, or form? How do we identify those, and how do we handle those in a blend? What's going to happen when we look at like low surface brightness galaxies? And, and then also open to whatever ideas that you all might have and that anybody else has on what we might be missing. So what cases have other people run across looking at blended images that we're not accounting for yet and not thinking about? So the current status, right now the MES DeBlender package in the stack has a multiband DeBlend task, and so this will run Scarlet in the LSST stack. it has to be updated with the latest version. And so the idea is that so this task is going to run Scarlet on all the blends in an image and generate a source catalog for the results. That's basically exactly the same as what the current DeBlender is outputting. Although we actually allow it to give two different catalogs. You can get a catalog that's just the templates, and then you can get a catalog that's used the templates to reweight the flux. And so this will be useful for people looking at their various science cases and seeing, is it better to do measurements on the templates or on the models or on the reweighted data. But right now there aren't any measurement tools in the stack that make use of these outputs, right? So essentially all the measurement algorithms are still doing, working on one band at a time, or at least, collecting bands in the same exact way they do with the outputs from the current DeBlender, including force photometry. And so that's something that probably will need to change in the future. And then right now, probably within the next day, we'll be merging a number of multiband classes into the stack. So for anybody that's been using that, images and footprints, exposures, can be a multiband array. So now you have a first dimension that's the filter, and then two spatial dimensions. And so this should just make it easier to kind of handle multiband objects. And then also within the next week, we should have some command line tasks that are being restructured to allow both the current and the new DeBlender to be kind of used interchangeably in a pipeline that uses the command line tasks. And so the goal is for all of that work to be done by the blending workshop, and there should be a tutorial available then in just a few weeks.
Can you clarify what is meant by footprint here? This is a question by Tom Loreto.
Oh, sure. So the footprint is just, instead of having like just a rectangular box around an object, a footprint is an object that's in the LSST stack that just uses the pixels that are above whatever threshold was set, whatever noise threshold. So it's, potentially can have, it's a collection of pixels that's not continuous in both X and Y.
So it acts something like an irregular aperture.
Yeah, I mean it's mostly
You're
done
fitting within it, but you're restricting the fitting to some initial some partition of the pixels.
Right. It's mostly a way to save on memory and processing time, because there's if you know, especially if you have kind of an irregularly shaped object, or especially in a blend where you haven't separated things out yet, you'll have a lot of pixels that are essentially zero, and so this is a way to make sure that you're only processing on the pixels that you care about.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense.
Yep. More general thumbnail kind of thing, or postage stamp.
Yeah. Okay, so for more information, here's a link to the Scarlet paper that I was mentioning. And you can also download Scarlet now and get that up and running. It should be fairly simple. We've had a number of people that have started using it outside of the LSST group. And then we also have the docs that have examples, tutorials, and just kind of a general documentation of the API. So that's what I have. Thank you.
Excellent. Are there any more questions? So is there anything that we should do that you would recommend to prepare for the workshop in the light of the talk that you gave, and particularly in the light of the comment that you made that you are seeking advice about cases of blending that you may not have thought of yet?
Yeah, I would say if anybody has images and that you're looking at and things that are really tough to blend and maybe not sure how they'd be handled, certainly like collecting those and maybe bringing some of those to the workshop could be useful. And if you go back and you look at this and you see something and you're just like, well, no, I'm dealing with a case that's definitely not symmetric and monotonic. how are we going to handle this? Or just, be thinking about anything else that we may be missing. That would be really useful. Yeah.
Excellent. If there are no questions, I'm going to point out that Robert had a few more comments, including that spirals were not much of a problem in SDSS DeBlender. Robert, do you want to comment on that?
But I'm not convinced it would be a problem. One of the lessons we took from Happy Moolekamp data was that the sort of crowdings we're getting down to in these deep images, one's intuition from previous surveys doesn't necessarily work. So your intuition that spirals are a disaster, but it doesn't mean that it's not right at LSST depth.
All right, thank you.
If you see what I mean.
So yeah, so the only thing that I would say to that is there's still, there's an open ticket right now on the current DeBlender because spirals tend to get shredded, and there's still, how exactly to recombine those, I think is still an open question that needs to be addressed at some point.
Excellent. So I don't see any other questions in the chat. We will post the notes that Phil has diligently been taking on community. You already have the link to review them. We will post the link to the recording of the meeting. And with that, thank you very much, Fred, and hopefully you'll see a lot of us at the project community meeting.
Sounds good. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, everybody. No call next month, and we'll reconvene in September for these monthly calls.
Thanks a lot, Fred. Really, really helpful.
Thank you.
Thank you.